Thanks for hanging in, everybody. As Bob said, I'm a pharmacologist by training. I've spent most of my career doing research on nicotine, and David sort of swept me over to the cannabidiol side before his unfortunate passing. And so, it's been a really exciting time to be in this area. Epidiolex is an approved FDA medication that contains cannabidiol. And so the real challenge, I think, moving forward is, hopefully the science will catch up with the marketing for CBD and we'll have new products on the market soon. Why can't I change my... So a new word that I want to introduce everyone to today is a xenobiotic. A xenobiotic is a substance that shows up in your body that isn't made by your body. So it's a non-endogenous substance that is put in your body. Many of these xenobiotics are natural products. They can come from plants, perhaps animals as well, or artificially manufactured chemicals, pharmaceuticals, pesticides, cosmetics. So anything that is not made by your body, once these substances get in your body, they have chemical structures that resemble endogenous compounds that are present in your body. And when these xenobiotics enter into your body or your brain, they sort of fake out these normal systems and change the activity of the central nervous system. And so here are a few examples of some xenobiotics that most people are probably familiar with. Nicotine from a tobacco plant, cocaine from a coca plant, morphine from a poppy, or delta-9 THC from cannabis. And so these compounds, once they get into your body, they interact with endogenous systems. So nicotine activates something called a nicotinic type of acetylcholine receptor. So acetylcholine is this normal substance in the body that has to interact with the receptor protein to have a function. And when nicotine gets in the body, it sort of fakes that receptor out. It makes it think it's acetylcholine. Cocaine blocks something called the dopamine transporter. And when cocaine blocks the dopamine transporter, dopamine, an endogenous substance, builds up in the synapse, and that makes people get high off of cocaine. Morphine activates something called a mu-opioid receptor. So our body makes its own opioids. It makes something called endorphins that are naturally pain modulating molecules. And so morphine just acts by activating those endorphin receptors. Delta-9 THC is an agonist for a particular type of endocannabinoid receptor. So our body also makes its own cannabinoids. And so when delta-9 THC gets into our body, it activates a CB1 endocannabinoid receptor. Okay, so really it wasn't known that our body made endogenous cannabinoids until around the turn of the century, when the endogenous substances, anandamide and 2-acylglycerol, were identified. And these substances are made by postsynaptic neurons in the central nervous system, and some type of activity of that postsynaptic cell affects their release. Then they diffuse out of the cell and sort of move backwards across the synapse and bind to presynaptic cannabinoid receptors on presynaptic nerve cells. And this leads to a change in neurotransmitter release. And it's these changes in neurotransmitter release that give these endocannabinoids some type of a functional property and alter your physiology. So in the central nervous system, we mostly have CB1 receptors. There's another type of cannabinoid receptor that's located on peripheral immune cells, but something like THC activates both of these CB1 and CB2 receptors. So these endocannabinoids, 2-AG and 2-acylglycerol, they're normally broken down by an enzyme called fatty acid amide hydrolase. So again, the body has its own system for making these substances, releasing them, using them, and degrading them. So what about phytocannabinoids? I think that's what most of us are interested in today. Cannabis contains, over 100 different cannabinoids, plus over 100 different terpene molecules, and all of these molecules have some type of pharmacological activity. THC and CBD are the ones that are getting the most press, but people are interested in many other types of cannabinoids, other types of delta-8 THC. So many different compounds still have to, we need information to figure out exactly how these compounds work. So THC is the delta-9 THC is the component of cannabis that causes the positive reinforcing effects. This is the chemical in cannabis that causes euphoria or drug intoxication, or the addictive properties of cannabis. And so as we know, in order for it to be industrial hemp, it has to have a low level of THC. So THC acts as an agonist at both CB1 and CB2 receptors. The image on the right that you see is a picture, a slice of a rat brain, where basically I have used radioactive THC to show where THC works in the brain. Those two sort of banana-shaped areas are areas called the hippocampus, that are very high in CB1 receptors. The hippocampus is the part of the brain that's involved with learning and memory. So when people use cannabis, it binds to these CB1 receptors in the hippocampus, affects neurotransmitter release, and makes people stupid when they are smoking cannabis. So CBD, interestingly, does not agonize either CB1 or CB2 receptors. So because it doesn't bind to the CB1 receptor, it doesn't produce this intoxicating or euphoriant effect. However, a lot of people say that CBD is not psychoactive, right? And that's the first thing they'll say about what's not psychoactive. Well, if somebody is using CBD to reduce their anxiety or to facilitate their sleep, it's having psychoactive properties, right? So it does affect the activity of the nervous system. It just doesn't cause this intoxication effect that THC causes. Okay, all of the growers on here are mostly growing at this point to try to get CBD because there is a huge interest in a number of different pathological conditions that possibly could be treated with CBD. Everything from Alzheimer's to autism is being purported. But for right now, the marketing of CBD is way ahead of the science. So CBD, how does it work? Well, nobody knows how it works. So that's a challenge for us scientists. The effects of CBD are said to be pleiotropic in nature, and pleiotropic means that CBD has a low level or moderate interaction with many different types of endogenous systems. So it doesn't, cocaine works by blocking the dopamine transporter. So it's very specific in its mechanism, whereas CBD potentially interacts with many different types of systems in the body. So it's been shown to be an agonist of a particular serotonin receptor. There's a drug called Buspar that interacts with that serotonin receptor. And so perhaps if CBD has an anti-anxiety effect, it's because it's binding to the serotonin receptor. It's also an agonist at something called the glycine receptor, and agonists of glycine receptor have anti-epilepsy properties. And so perhaps that's how it works in the treatment of convulsive disorders. It binds also to these mu opioid receptors, and so perhaps that's related to its analgesic actions. It inhibits enzymes like cyclooxygenase and lipoxygenase. These are the enzymes that are inhibited by drugs like ibuprofen. And so if these drugs have CBD has anti-inflammatory properties, it may be by blocking COX and LOX. It binds to transient potential receptors that perhaps ties into the analgesic actions. And so there's many different types of pharmacological properties that could potentially be therapeutically useful with CBD. The other thing that CBD does is it sort of blocks the activity of this enzyme that degrades these endocannabinoids. So CBD also is thought to perhaps enhance the activity of endogenous cannabinoids, and some people refer to this as the entourage effect. So given the hundreds of different other cannabinoids and terpenes, even more likely biological targets are likely for these drugs. And so this approved drug, Epidiolex, all approved medications come with a package insert. And I just wanted to show this part of the package insert from Epidiolex that admits to the patients that take it, the mechanism by which this drug is causing anticonvulsant activity is not known. And so most people falsely believe that if a drug makes it to the market, we scientists know how it works, and that's not always true. Sometimes, and patients don't care, of course, they just want their convulsions to decrease. So what has to happen for these compounds to be FDA approved? This slide just sort of overviews the phases of clinical drug evaluation and development. Hopefully, studies are going to be done on pure compounds, not mixtures of compounds, because if you have a broad spectrum extract and you show that it's useful for something, you don't really know what component of that extract is going to be responsible for those beneficial properties. So in clinical trials, what happens is first there's something called a phase 1 trial. And in a phase 1 trial, you recruit healthy volunteers and they volunteer to take the drug just to see if it's safe. There's no particular therapeutic outcome. They're just trying to look for safety. And so if the drug is safe, it can go on to phase 2. And in phase 2, they recruit a small number of patients that have the disease or the condition that you intend to treat. And then you're recruiting people with anxiety or sleep disorders, and you're giving them the drug and seeing if their sleep disorder improves or their anxiety improves. If it shows that there is some efficacy for the treatment of that disease, then it moves into phase 3. And phase 3 is a really tough one because phase 3 trials are double-blinded and placebo-controlled. And what that means is that half of the patients are getting a fake medication and half of them are getting the real medication, and the doctor doesn't know and the patient doesn't know who's getting what. So this is the place where many drugs fail in clinical trials. They are shown to be safe in phase 1. They're shown to treat some symptoms in phase 2, but once you put them against the placebo, it fails. And so this is the general process, and these are some of the studies that are underway right now. I was in a meeting with the FDA last week, and this was an interesting study that I just wanted to highlight to show the innovative ways in which people are trying to start to answer these questions. So this is a study that's at the University of Colorado, where they can do lots of good things out there. And so they want to compare THC, the combination of THC and CBD versus CBD alone for the treatment of anxiety. And so they have a really cool cannabis use mobile lab, they call it. So they take the lab out to somebody's house. The person comes into the mobile lab, they have a blood draw, they have an interview and an assessment of their anxiety. Then they go back into their house and they use THC the way they normally use it. They use THC with CBD the way they normally use it, or they use CBD alone the way they normally use it. Then they go back out to the van and they have 2 more hours of blood testing, anxiety testing, and they're doing direct comparisons to see which of these drugs actually affects anxiety. And their preliminary data suggests that particularly in women, CBD seems to have a clear beneficial effect on anxiety, whereas THC has the opposite effect. THC alone increases anxiety, and that might not be a surprise, but this is one of the first studies that is actually going to look at these things. And then they're also looking at all these peripheral blood markers of inflammation to see if taking THC with CBD or CBD alone has any anti-inflammatory properties based on blood markers. So just to finish up, I wanted to just talk about, from my view, what some of the challenges for success for CBD are. In general, the whole industry is underregulated, and some manufacturers have low compliance. The FDA has sent out a couple of warning letters maybe, but I don't think anybody's, too concerned about the letters they're getting, because it doesn't really seem like anybody's watching. And even if you are out of compliance, it's not clear what the consequences are. So, that's a challenge. And what is a bigger challenge is that with all of the marketing that's going on now and all the product claims, we got to make sure that we're getting good product out for people to use, because if stuff is underlabeled, not what it's supposed to be, and it turns out not to work, then consumer confidence is going to go away for CBD, and obviously we don't want that to happen. So GMP is really important. This is not a checkbox in the process. This is a culture that manufacturers have to develop, and some well-defined legal system to sort of regulate the area would be nice, instead of the sort of the current honor system that we're on. So right now, what we do know about CBD is that compared to other drugs that are used to treat just about any medical condition, CBD has a lower possibility of causing adverse effects, or side effects, as some people call them. In the Epidiolex trial, they gave volunteers up to 1,500 a gram and a half a day of CBD for a month. None of them had any adverse responses to that. Then they cut them off, and when they cut them off, nobody had any type of a withdrawal response or anything like that. So it seems pretty safe. In healthy individuals, CBD doesn't typically alter basic physiology like heart rate or blood pressure, body temperature, GI tract activity. It doesn't cause drug intoxication. The main adverse responses are sleepiness, but if you're using it to try to facilitate your sleep, that's not really an adverse effect, is it? Decreased appetite. Some people would like to have a decreased appetite, and diarrhea is a common adverse effect in many different types of medications. More importantly, what we don't know about CBD. So we don't know if it works predictably and safely for any other medical condition besides rare forms of pediatric epilepsy. So we got a lot of work to do in terms of doing the research to see that it's safe and useful for the treatment of other conditions. It'd be great to know how it works, and not only how CBD works, but what about all these other phytocannabinoids and terpenes. We don't know what the best type of product is: a broad spectrum oil, a distillate oil, an isolate. What's the best dose to use? What's the best frequency and route of administration? We've only been doing CBD consumer for a couple of years now. So does it work for 10 or 15 years for sleep, or do people eventually develop tolerance to that type of effect? What about other medications in CBD? And in particular, the one thing that we don't worry about, or we don't know about, and the FDA is particularly concerned with, is that special populations like children and pregnant and nursing mothers, people at the FDA are worried that, some product is going to be sold to parents of kids with autism, and they're going to give them a high dose, and something bad's going to happen, and the FDA is just going to pull the plug on the whole thing. So that's my talk for today, and I'll end up by thanking David, as we've previously done, because he sort of introduced me to the field, and I thank you all for your attention.